Hello, welcome to the premium edition, the Gopher Ball podcast. I am Big Italy 42 here with Scott Mailwig, Sports 25 to Life on Twitter, and we're going to be discussing, eventually in this podcast, we're going to be getting into some trends and hitters and things like that, some hot and cold streaks, maybe some guys batting higher or lower in the order than they typically do, but obviously with it being opening day, we're just going to talk about some guys who had some big spring trainings. We're going to talk about some advanced statistics, kind of give you guys an idea of what we look at in our research, and try to help you out with that and make your more streamlined process there while you're doing your research during the day. So we're going to start off also talking about a couple of Vegas lines and some games that you might want to target today. So Scott's got a couple lines here, a few different games that are high totals, not many surprisingly for an opening day, but also a lot of aces on the bump. So which games are we targeting here with the high totals?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit on the DraftKings podcast this morning. The Rockies and Brewers is probably the most likely game you're going to want to target. We think that'll be probably the most stacked one against Kyle Kendrick for the Brewers. That over-under is at 8, which is the highest of the day. There's one other game at that we'll get to. It's minus 1.5 right now. So, I mean, that means we're probably thinking like 5 or so runs for the Rockies here, or for the Brewers here against the Rockies and Kendrick. So I think that's probably the game we're going to want to target, the lineup we're going to want to target. That's the premier one. The other line that's 8 right now is the Blue Jays and Yankees. We mentioned Tanaka's banged up. That's going to make it a little bit tougher on him going up against a really tough Blue Jays lineup. The line's really good here. Hutchinson isn't a guy I'm really scared of either. I'm really targeting lefties against him today. Ellsbury is a big one for me. I think I'm really fond of him in the outfield. That's probably going to be one of my main outfield plays today. Who are you looking at in that game?
Well, I'll say this, definitely with the those two games now being the same exact total. Obviously, the Brewers are the chalk play of the day. Everyone's going in on the Brewers. So it seems to me that a Blue Jays and or Yankees, or maybe stacking both of them, might be a nice tournament swerve since Brewers will be so highly owned. So
yeah, that's a good call.
Yeah, I mean, you already mentioned Edwin Encarnacion on the podcast earlier. You obviously got to look at Jose Bautista. Joey Bats had himself a really nice spring too. He's $4,900 on DraftKings. His FanDuel price I'll have to find here in just a second, but he's got a nice price tag. And obviously, if you're stacking the Blue Jays and you're not getting Encarnacion and Bautista, there's really no point in stacking those guys at all because chances are if someone's going yard, it's going to be one of those two guys.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as far as the rest of these lines go, there's a decent amount of 7s and 7.5s. Nothing I feel really strongly about. Most of these lines are minus 1.5, which seems about the norm. As far as like other highly targeted games, I don't think there's going to be a lot with so many aces. I think it's going to be a really diverse day with so many aces throwing. Like you mentioned, Kendrick is by far the worst pitcher out there. So we'll see a lot of Brewers stacks. But other than that, I mean, we're looking at all aces like Kershaw, Shields, Bumgarner, Price is throwing today, Samardzija's throwing today, Weaver and Ventura are throwing today. So there's going to be a lot of lineup diversity in tournaments, I think. And as we move through the season, that changes a little bit as the aces aren't all throwing together and stuff like that. But I think we're going to see a lot of different lineups out there today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even a couple aces facing each other. So those are some easy games to avoid. Like the Dodgers and Padres, I mean, you've got Shields, who obviously not a Kershaw ace, but an ace in his own right. So that's a game that's, I'm not saying completely avoid it as advice necessarily, but, you know, that's a game you're not going to want to be actively targeting with. I think it's a 6-run total. So, you know, those are the kind of games on a slate like this that you really don't want to invest too heavily in at all.
Yeah, exactly. Outside of the pitching, as far as hitting goes, you can pretty much just avoid that unless there's a guy that ends up hitting really high up in the lineup that is really cheap or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're new to MLB DFS, here's a little word of advice for you. Don't ever play guys against Clayton Kershaw unless you're just trying to be crazy. Unless you think you're going to be that one guy that finds the one hitter. I think it was Matt Carpenter last year hit a 3-run homer off him one time, and that was some guy won a tournament on FanDuel that I was in off that home run, which good for him, but at the same time, terrible play. You don't play a guy like that against Clayton Kershaw. So just a little word of advice there. But we're going to go ahead and break down some statistics that we use that help us a lot in our research, and we think that are really, really key to doing your research when you're making your MLB lineups. So the first one of them is WOBA, which is weighted on base average. a lot of people look at batting average. That's obviously the age-old statistic that everyone knows, but it's not the be-all, end-all. Obviously, WOBA takes into account their total offensive value. I'll give you the actual definition from Fangraphs. Measures a hitter's overall offensive value based on the relative values of each distinctive offensive event. For instance, reaching base on a walk, error, takes everything into account. Slugging percentage, on base percentage, all of those things. So it's not so cut and dry when you see, for instance, the guy's batting 280. You could have a WOBA in the high 300 or the mid 300s, like a guy like Joey Votto when he's batting under 300. I'll give you my hometown reference. He has a really high WOBA because he's a great hitter. He gets pitched around sometimes, so he's more likely to get you those free points from being on base. So he makes for a safer cash game play because he gets on base a lot. So you can look at a guy like that where, yes, he might not have the upside, the power in a tournament, but he's a nice guy to slot in at first base. He's going to get on base a couple times more often than not, and you can just kind of move on from there.
Yeah, definitely. As far as that goes, I mean, one guy that has a really nice WOBA against righties is Adam Lind, who we talked about earlier also. He's a left-handed hitter going up against Kendrick today. We mentioned him at Milwaukee lineup. I think he's up near 370 in his career against righties, which is just a massive number. He's one of the best split players in the league. I love him at first base today. There's a lot of good first base options, like we talked about Encarnacion for the Blue Jays already. I think Lind is probably the premier cash game play here, where we can get a little bit more power from someone like Encarnacion, or I know you like Abreu.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are the guys with the higher upside, definitely. But on a night like tonight, I mean, obviously there's not really any must plays because obviously all but two teams in play, tons of aces on the mound. So
yeah,
that's a really key statistic. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, I mean, find me on Twitter, or Scott, or one of us, or at DF Cafe. But if you go to Fangraphs and you look in their glossary, you can find all these statistics. It gives incredibly detailed. It gives you the algorithm for how you make it, the formula. Who's good? What's an average score? What's a great? I mean, a great WOBA shows you excellent is 400. I mean, that sounds like video game numbers, but you've got guys like Abreu, like Troy Tulowitzki, especially at home. Those guys put up those numbers in their sleep, which just tells you right there. I mean, that really is the ultimate statistic for a hitter, and I think that most people would agree with that.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see who else we want to go over here a little bit. I like Bryce Harper quite a bit today. I think his price is just in a really, really good spot. In the second half of last year, he had a 360 WOBA, which I thought was a really good improvement over what he did in the first half. He wasn't quite as good in the first half as he was in the second half. Looked like he took a little bit of a step forward. It always remains to be seen when you're trying to carry over seasons because it's such a long off season and so much changes. But he was red hot to end the year last year. I think he hit 10 home runs in his last under 200 at bats. So I think he's in for a good start. He faces Cologne today, who's a right-handed pitcher. I like that matchup quite a bit also.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's got a ton of power, and I don't know if you saw the most recent Sports Illustrated, but looks like his forearm game's on point too because his forearms are massive. So he's been doing his workouts in the offseason, and the crazy thing is the kid's only 22 years old. So, I mean, significant upside with him, especially tonight at that discounted price tag. If he has himself a big game, I can't imagine DraftKings and FanDuel leaving his price low for much longer. So I got one other sneaky guy that you might want to look at here. Is Brandon Moss. Had himself a really nice spring and coming over from Oakland, obviously. And he's a guy that mashes righties, can't touch lefties to save his life. But, he's got a significant upside in a lot of places. And if you look at his splits, I'm bringing up his WOBA here. And you got him against lefties. He's got a 356 WOBA, 336 WOBA against righties. And what I meant to say was the isolated power. Sorry, the isolated power is what he's got against righties. 213 isolated power versus 161. And that's another big statistic when, maybe you're taking a shot at some guys that are cheap in the outfield. You want some power. That's the statistic that I use also on Fangraphs that really just tells you, how hard the ball is hit, essentially. It gives you their actual raw power. So some of the guys are kind of a given. You got your Miguel Cabreras and Jose Abreu and all the guys we've mentioned before. But that's a nice tiebreaker there if you're looking between two cheap guys.
Yeah, definitely. One guy that has fantastic advanced stats, so we were all hoping was going to hit higher in the lineup today, was Scooter Gennett. I mean, his numbers are just really, really solid for a second baseman. I think he was up near 350 WOBA last year against right-handed pitchers. He was over 150 ISO, which for a second baseman is a fantastic number. He just has a lot of pop in that bat. His prices are really low. He had a really nice year overall last year. I mean, I was playing him so often last year against righties that it was just, I felt like I was just putting him in my lineup every day for a while there. And I'm hoping he moves up in the lineup at some point this year. I know they have a pretty stacked lineup, but I'd like to see him hit a little bit higher because it just makes him hard to use when he's hitting in that 7-8 spot because if you're sacrificing an at bat, it's just really hard, especially when there's so many second basemen and shortstops hitting at the top of the lineup.
Yeah, and we see that a lot, and it's a really tough thing when you see him that low, and especially in a good matchup. But like you mentioned, if you're ever going to play anyone that low, it's going to be a cheap guy in the middle infield that you normally doesn't have a lot of value. I mean, if you're an NBA guy just coming over to MLB, you can kind of equate it to small forward. It's usually a pretty weak position, not a lot of power, not a ton of upside. But a guy like Scooter Gennett, usually, especially at his cheap price, makes for a nice filler there if he's batting up top.
Yep, absolutely.
To touch back on the isolated power here real quick, it's isolated power is determined by the slugging percentage minus the average. There's more specific things here. Extra bases divided by at-bats. And it really just tells you, obviously if you got a guy with a lot of power, for instance, that has good splits against a certain hand, like Crush Davis from the Brewers with a K, is a good example of this. He has a ton of power against lefties, not a ton against righties. And he makes for a great guy, especially at Brewer Stadium, Miller Park, or another hitter's park. He's a great guy to play in tournaments against lefties because he's got a ton of isolated power. And even if they're batting low in that order, it only takes you one time in a tournament for that guy to get a hold of one and pay off his cheap tag.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the big thing is targeting power, especially in tournaments. Power and speed are the two biggest factors in tournaments for the most part. If you can get a guy that steals a couple bases or has a couple extra base hits, you're going to feel really good about it. I mean, there's so much on the slate today. There's a ton of guys like that where we can just go down the list of all kinds of guys. Ellsbury, like I mentioned earlier, is a big guy for me that can give you both of those things, I feel like today. He's in that game that's tied for the highest over-under. He can steal you a couple of bases. He can give you that home run. I'm not a big fan of Hutchinson. I think that's a great matchup for Ellsbury. I believe he's batting leadoff if I saw that lineup out right before we started this, which is obviously perfect. I prefer not to draft leadoff guys for really expensive prices just because I think there's more value in the 2, 3, 4 spots. But the extra at-bat potential is just as solid and at the top of the order there, and I really like everything he's offering today.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. I mean, Jacoby Ellsbury, yeah, he is leading off as I see now, and another guy that's real similar to that, Carlos Gomez. We talked about him earlier as well. I mean, kind of the great combination between speed and power. So I'm with you. I'm not huge on leadoff guys unless it's a cheap guy with some speed, like Adam Eaton in some spots. On-base guy, a little bit of speed, not a lot of power, but you don't really need it there with the big bats behind him. They'll score, and you're going to get your extra at-bats there also. But at the same time, you're kind of taking away your RBI potential, especially in the National League when you've got the pitcher batting right behind you later on in the game, or right before, I should say.
Yeah, that's the tough part there. It definitely hurts more in the National League where you don't have as many guys on base. Not that the 9 hitters in the American League are all fantastic, but, I mean, just a major improvement from a pitcher to any other hitter. Having guys on base for RBI potential, hitting with guys on base is just a little bit easier for the most part. I don't love the leadoff thing, but I mean, you're going to have to play some guys in the leadoff spot throughout the season and pay up for them a little bit. But like we said, you're getting the extra at bat sometimes, and you always have the great hitters hitting after them, which is a huge thing, especially for runs scored.
Yeah, and that's another thing to consider also if you're making a stack or you're trying to figure out your lineups for your tournaments. Targeting more guys from the AL over the long run is going to help you because, you don't have that pitcher. You don't have that basically a void of a spot there. So you've got more potential for guys on base, more potential for the guy to drive you in, etc. So it's a subtle difference, but if you're deciding especially between two similar players, you're going to go with the guy in an AL team because generally a higher total, more runs scored, all of those things.
Yeah, and you can make those, if there's like a absolute minimum price guy hitting 9th for a team that you really like the top of their order, you can do that like wraparound stack where you play 9, 1, 2, 3 or something like that too, which is always an interesting tournament play. But as much as we hate playing guys at the bottom of the lineup, if you can get a minimum price guy hitting 9th and you really like the guys at the top of that team's order, it can be a beneficial play.
Yeah, and especially due to the fact that no one ever plays the 9-hitters. We're over here both talking about how we don't play them. But like Scott said, it makes sense a lot to play. If you're playing a bunch of stacks, you play that 9-hitter because not only will it be really low owned, but, if that guy gets on, drives in a couple runs, scores a run, then you got a huge advantage in a tournament.
Yeah, especially when he's really cheap. And that's how 9-hitters usually are. I mean, for the most part, you're getting them pretty close to minimum. There's just not a lot of profit potential there when you're just selecting a 9-hitter on a team that you don't have anyone else from, because it's not correlated really well with anything else you're doing. It's just not the best play unless you're like really working it into a stack.
Yeah. I think the 8-hitter is the ultimate black hole, if you ask me, especially in the National League. I mean, you generally have a bad hitter right ahead of you in the 7-hole. You're probably a pretty bad hitter too if you're batting 8th, and then you got a pitcher coming up behind you. So you'll be very fortunate if you ever find a lineup I make with an 8-hitter in it, especially in a National League team.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're right. It's just a black hole where there's nothing working for you in that situation, and it makes it really tough to get any profit potential out of the spot.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right, well, that's our short but effective strategy scenario for you there, talking a little bit about today's opening slate and talking about some advanced statistics also. So, like I said, check out fangraphs.com if you want to check out some more explanation about some of these statistics, maybe some other ones as well. Hit one of us up on Twitter if you got some more questions. And we will see you guys again for the next podcast. I'm going to be talking some DraftKings, some FanDuel, some advanced statistics, all these things coming Monday through Saturday from now on. So we'll see you guys again tomorrow.